Hello and welcome. I am talking today with author of a new book called Mary MacSwiney by Leeann Lane. And Leanne, I'd love you to share about the anti-treaty female leader Mary and a little bit about your book and the summary behind her career, if you don't mind, please.
Thank you, Yvonne. Mary was involved in politics from an early age in Cork. She qualified as a teacher and she was out of the country teaching in the early 20th century, coming back home when her mother died in 1904. Well, she came back in 1906. And at that point, then she becomes very heavily involved in kind of culture nationalist politics in Cork, the kind of language movement, interested in the theatre movement, and very much influenced, I think, by her brother Terence, who,
Mm.
when she returned to Cork, was involved in that type of activity in Cork. Um, from there, the family and all family members, and I talk of them as a kind of a Republican family unit. From there, they moved on to advanced nationalism, but they were very careful to say at all times, and Mary made this point during the treaty debates, they did not join Sinn Féin until it became Republican. So they didn't join Sinn Féin before the Rising, even though there was a branch in Cork. Mary did set up the Mary set up the Cork branch of Cumann in June 1914, becoming the president. And her brother then, from January 1916, underwent a cycle of kind of imprisonments, and she's very much involved in prisoner aid during the War of Independence. Cork, of course, does not rise during the 1916 Rising, so it's not out because
Yeah.
of communication. So she kind of absorbs her brother's kind of distress at that. Her brother was second in command in the Irish Volunteers in Cork. So, as I said, he enters into a kind of a cycle of imprisonment, release, imprisonment from January 1916, in fact. And she's involved in prisoner aid. She's involved in visiting her brother and visiting prisoners interned after 1916 across England and Wales, and then involved in prisoner aid during the War of Independence. And then, of course, what catapults her, I think, into kind of national politics is the death of her brother, Terence, and
Yeah.
hunger strike in Brixton in 1920. And
Yeah.
I tried to kind of think about what she felt as she literally watched day by day her brother getting more and more malnourished, inching closer to death, and at the same time the family feeling that the British government are not actually going to allow this to happen. And it was, I would suggest, kind of a trauma that she experienced. And the way
Mm.
in which the trauma manifested itself was not kind of, that she retreated into a kind of a breakdown, because trauma doesn't always manifest like that. It
Yeah.
means she cannot have anything other than the republic for which her brother fought for. So she
She really
devotes.
took over his mantle then, didn't she, his
Absolutely.
mission?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I would.
Yeah.
Yeah. So she goes to speak to the American Commission on Conditions in Ireland in Washington in December 1920, which must have been very traumatic for her. Like, she's back from Brixton. She set up this really interesting school in Cork, first lay Catholic school for girls, when she was sacked from St. Angela's College because of her participation in Republican politics in 1916. So she comes back from Brixton and she has to kind of get herself back into running the school. And then immediately then she has to go to Washington with her sister-in-law Muriel. And I think there's really no understanding of how well versed she was in Irish history until she starts speaking at the commission. And at that point, then De Valera tasks her with continuing a tour that he had been on for the past year and a half in America, and she's away from home until August 1921, and she's really building up a name for herself in that context. She's actually elected to the second Dáil while she's in America, and she comes back then to what she describes as a kind of a country rife with rumour about compromise, because of course when she comes back the truce is in place and the
Yeah.
negotiation place
And
to set.
I think really De Valera probably admired her deeply. I know he called her incorrigible, but
I think
really that's probably an admiration for her beliefs as well, I'd say. What do you think?
I would agree. I think they were very close, politically
Yeah.
close to the Civil War. And actually, he conducted a really interesting correspondence with her during the Civil War, where he laid his political soul bare to her. He talked about writing letters to her that he wouldn't have written to anybody else, about his concern at
Yeah.
how the war was going. And of course, De Valera felt that he was on the wrong side, arguably, in the Civil War. De Valera was a parliamentarian, so he found himself on the wrong side. They talk about De Valera's wilderness years before he established his Fianna Fáil, whereas Mary was trying to encourage him to stay strong, and Mary couldn't consider compromise. And that has a relevance, I think, until De Valera establishes Fianna Fáil. But after De Valera establishes Fianna Fáil, the fourth Sinn Féin party just becomes kind of concerned with splits and regulations. And at that point, her life is really just increasingly narrow in terms of her politics.
But she was probably like a kind of a confidant, a political confidant of De Valera's, because they had so much. She was so intelligent, and I think that's probably why the relationship was so good as well.
Um, Absolutely. No, he was irritated with her at times, and she,
Yeah,
interestingly, because she has this kind of a reputation of being a real virago. That's how she was portrayed in the newspapers. But she wrote to him a couple of times, "Don't be cross if I say this to you." So yes, they had a real kind of connection, a political connection. But
yeah,
when he breaks with Sinn Féin in 1926 to form Fianna Fáil, his letters to her become much more kind of curt and irascible. And the sense is that those who remain in Sinn Féin in 1926, are refusing to accept, real politique and the
yeah.
realities of the state in existence.
But I think the women, even the women leaders back then, they were very invisible. I mean, it was a very male dominated
Mm,
era. So,
mm.
like what you were saying earlier on about, we were talking just before we came on about trolling, and she was a real influencer of her time. That term is bandied about so much now, but she was one of the first influencers really in political Irish history.
Yeah, I don't know whether I would describe her as an influencer because I think she was somebody who stood up for what she believed in, but because she was a woman,
Yeah,
she was subject to a lot of vitriol that men on the anti-treaty side were not. She was certainly admired, if that's what you mean by an influencer,
yeah,
by her female
yeah.
colleagues. Yes, absolutely. And I think that's quite interesting. There's a recognition, amongst people like Maura Comfort or Kathleen Brewer or Kathleen Lynn, that oftentimes, that she was treated badly by the men on the anti-treaty side. Um, she was somebody who, didn't care. She, as she said during the treaty debates, to sneers from Martha Griffiths, etc. I don't care if I take more of your time than you're willing to give. But she certainly was somebody who I think, was subject to a lot of kind of gendered criticism. She was she was used to emasculate De Valera. She was
Mm.
described as having De Valera in her vanity bag by somebody. She was described as like the Queen in Alice in Wonderland. She just wanted everybody's head to be chopped off. She was described as, having, poison dripping from her fangs. She
So
was
imagine her if she was on Twitter this day and age. We were just
absolutely,
saying.
yeah, absolutely. One would hope she'd be on Blue Sky, not Twitter.
Exactly. And she would, like what you said earlier, she would be trolled. She probably would have got a lot of attacks
Well,
on the likes of social media if it was around then.
she did because she got attacks, really gendered
Yeah,
attacks in the mainstream press. She was used to, as I say, emasculate De Valera.
yeah.
De Valera was in America. Uh, Trying to get funds for what would become the Irish Press and newspaper Fianna Fáil. There was discussions at by-elections, by Cum na Gael speakers, how De Valera has left the country, he's running away from Mary MacSwiney's, that
Yeah.
will De Valera up a tree where Mary MacSwiney can't get him. So yeah, she was absolutely criticised in a way that her male counterparts were not. And I think, it's sometimes very hard to remember, sometimes it's too easy to forget that there's human beings behind, that kind of level of
Yeah.
abuse. The one thing I did try to do in the book was to try to kind of understand Mary in a more holistic way than just kind of a cipher for extreme republicanism. She was somebody who was loved by her friends. She was absolutely loved by her family. She in turn loved her family, and her
Yeah.
relationship with her siblings was really, really important to her. So you can't divorce Mary, the sister, and the head of the family, essentially, from an early age, from the Mary who is, believing that Ireland should be fully independent. And everything
Yeah.
really was connected, the personal and the political, in that context for her.
But that political kind of stature, that politicians do have that kind of hard shell exterior, don't they? Even now, it is very hard to humanize that
Mhm.
aspect of being in the public arena. So I think even back then it was the same. It's very similar now as well. You don't really see that human side to
Yeah, absolutely.
politicians,
Agree.
you
Yeah.
know?
I think her personality was she was very sure of herself. I mean, I think very interesting, one thing I think that gave her a certain kind of confidence in herself is she was educated unusually for a woman at
Yeah,
the time, third level, so that allowed her to kind of hold her own. Um, but she did, in kind of asides, kind of talk about, the awfulness of Brixton, but the thing was
mm,
not to be seen to cry, not to be seen in public to
yeah,
cry or to show emotion. But that must have been very, very tiring and wearisome. But she was so much more than just an anti-treaty spokesperson. She, as I said, established this really, really progressive school in Cork. I actually ended up going to the successor school, and only writing this biography did I realize that certain things that, were kind of strange in the school compared to,
yeah,
had in other schools were things that she had implemented in the previous school. Um, a real kind of focus on, getting everybody to read a lot and to read outside the curriculum, and not a huge focus on exams in that time period. So it was a really progressive school. And as Roy Foster said, parents sent their children to that school not because it was a Republican school, but because it was a good school. So she was a
yeah. They
really,
knew she was behind it. Yeah,
yeah, yeah.
exactly.
She's so
Incredible.
much more, yeah, than she's a family person, she's an educator,
Mm,
intelligent. Now, she was somebody who didn't suffer fools, she could be
yeah,
irascible. So there were a lot of splits in coming on in Cork, and she was kind of always at the centre of the trouble. Um,
yeah. And
I
she had a
think
good relationship with her brother's wife as well, didn't she, Muriel?
to a point.
Mm.
She was at the wedding herself, and Annie went to the wedding. It was in at the open prison he was in at the time in 1917 in England. But Muriel, her suffered her own trauma, and she was young when Terence died. And
Yeah.
of course, she left Ireland in 1923, traveling across continental Europe and leaving Terence's daughter, Mary's niece, Moira Og, in a series of boarding schools. So in
Right.
1932, actually, Mary goes over to Germany and brings Moira Og back to live with her in Cork. And it's
Okay. Yeah.
subject
Took
of
her
a
under her wing,
yeah,
basically.
but it's the subject of a High Court case, and ever afterwards, Muriel claimed that Mary had kidnapped Moira Og
Okay.
with the connivance of the Irish government. But Terence had left Mary joint guardian of Moira Og even before he was on hunger strike in Brixton. So I think, it's
Mm.
important not to, blame Muriel. Muriel suffered her own trauma, but she never saw Moira Og again, which must have been very distressing for her.
Yeah. I mean, it even sounds like that they both suffered like PTSD, to a
Yeah,
degree, seeing all that and watching him die. And I mean, he was in
yeah.
prison for 4 years, wasn't he?
No, so he was on hunger strike for 74 days in Brixton. So he had been in and out of prison, yeah, for four
Yeah.
years, but died,
Yeah.
yeah. He'd been released at various points and then rearrested. But that 74-day hunger strike in Brixton was very traumatic. If you read the medical
Yeah.
notes, by the end, he's kind of urinating into his bed. He's hallucinating. He's kind of striking out, and also, the kind of the focus afterwards was, by his relatives to say that he had, had a good death, that this was a meaningful death. But the reality from his medical notes is that he was described as sullen and surly. Of course, if you were starving, that would be how you would be. And, if you're irritable, you take it out on those closest to you, I would think, so they must have also been kind of subject to some of his irritability, etc. So it must have been just the most shocking time as they watched.
Experience.
Uh, a, a relatively healthy, certainly on the surface. He had some underlying conditions, but there is a photograph of him in May 1920. He's arrested in August, later August, and it shows quite a good-looking man. Healthy in his early 40s, and then his body is described, his corpse is described as looking like a child of 12. In the city hall in
Killed.
Cork. Yeah.
Wow.
So this must have been just
Yeah.
so traumatic, and I
Horrendous to see.
I think, yeah. So Annie, for example, I'd say maybe manifested um, her trauma in a way that, was maybe understood better at the time. Now, she didn't have a breakdown, but she was sick for quite some time afterwards and, was quite, as Mary would say, highly strung. But Mary's kind of response is to just galvanize herself into action to ensure that
Yeah.
the public is achieved.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure you're glad that you finished the book now at this stage.
Yes,
Did
yeah.
it take you a long time to write it, Leanne?
Um, yeah, work intervened, so I think maybe just about 3 years. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So you're
No,
very proud. And the
I had
pictures and
started.
photos are fantastic as well. There's
Yeah,
some great old images there, isn't there, in it?
Yeah, and another thing, like about trolling her, she was always described by reference to her dress in a way that the men were not. She always wore that kind of black hat, and that was always kind of remarked. And that's something politicians, female politicians, have to deal with today. What they look like
It's
rather than.
quite glamorous, and it's all about what people see, isn't it? Perception is a dangerous thing sometimes as well.
Yeah,
And your book is due out now in this month.
yeah.
Should be soon enough. So I'm sure people will love to read about Mary MacSwiney. It sounds like a really, really interesting book. And thank you so much for sharing about Mary today, Leanne. And
Thank
good
you.
luck and congratulations on your book.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you so
you.
much. Thank you.